Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina, and my guest probably doesn't need an introduction, but just in case, Xandy Peters, welcome to my channel.
Hi.
And it's been 3 years since we tried to organize this meeting, so I'm so glad you finally were able to be squeezed me in your schedule. And what a schedule it is, we'll talk about that. But before we talk about all your design career and all the excitement of your traveling and things, let's talk about how it all started. I've heard you started very young, and your mom was also a knitter.
Yeah, so my mother taught me to knit when I was about 5 years old. I actually was able to do some projects even. She didn't just teach me the basic stitches. She got me my first sweater quantity of yarn when I was 8 years old for my birthday, and I made my first sweater. It was very simple. It was just a bunch of rectangles sewn together. Sometimes I think that in the early 90s and like in the 80s, sweaters were just easier to make because of the style being drop sleeve.
Right.
So it was a basic sweater, but it was pretty nice. And my father, shortly after it was finished, shrunk it in the washing machine.
Were you devastated?
Um, I think less than my mother was. Actually, it ended up on a teddy bear. It was okay. Like I was 8. I would have grown out of it probably pretty quickly anyway. But it ended up on a stuffed animal and probably got more use there than on me.
Do you remember what your mom was knitting?
I do. We had a lot of Rowan books. That was the primary thing. My mother actually had a little clothing company um, where she made like both sewn goods and things that were sewn, half knitting machine. So she had a big knitting machine and with like the color, like it wasn't a punch card, it was computerized and you could like put in the color patterns and do color work on it. So she was making a lot of that stuff when I was really young. But she used to make a lot of sweaters. We did mostly by those Rowan patterns.
I've heard somewhere you were mentioning that you were grew up on Cave Fawcett, and I must tell you, Cave is probably one of my most cherished interviews that I've done on this channel. And his love of color is just like what he is known for. Do you feel like you were influenced by his bold color choices?
Yes. And if so, you probably made the connection between Rowan and Cave because he did a lot of designs for them and he still does, but he was really like kind of like the star designer for them in the mid 90s. And so a lot of that I think did come from there. I never have made one of his things. I joke that everyone in the family had a cave sweater kit and nobody made the sweater. Like I've made stuff with the yarn, but there were a lot of like split up kits. When I lived up with my aunt and uncle in Boston, I had an internship and they let me like stay with them when I was right out of college. And my aunt was actually working on a scarf that was from one of his original kits, where he was holding like a bunch of yarns. He used to do the things with a bunch of yarns together and different textures. And it was all like reds and purples in a sawtooth pattern. And the sweater was just never going to happen, but she made it into a pretty nice scarf. So it's been around me, I think, a lot. And of course, whenever I'm at a quilt shop, I pick up some of his fabrics because that's my favorite. Because you can just buy them, like you can buy the colors directly from him.
Right.
And you don't have to knit anything.
Well, let's talk about you growing up. Was knitting the only craft you were doing, or were you generally crafty?
I did a lot of things. I did a lot of like basically any crafts. I didn't really like other things, like other activities. So at camp and stuff, I would always opt for the arts and crafts options. And I think it's actually interesting because you, as a kid, you don't realize that crafts are like real life skills, but realistically, kids who do crafts tend to be better at math. I went to a really interesting talk probably 5 years ago at Yale University, that I found through my local yarn shop in New Haven. And it was all about this mathematician who worked with crochet to create non-Euclidean geometry. She's super interesting. Her name is Dinah Taimina, and I might not be pronouncing that right. But she does these crochet things, and she talked a lot about how in her home country, when they removed needlework from schools, the math scores started falling.
Interesting.
So I think it's just really interesting and important. Sometimes people don't think of it as a STEM field, but like it's the beginning of a lot of like, it's an accessible way of thinking about like engineering sometimes for kids to do some crafts and to figure stuff out on their own with arts and crafts.
And it's like I was giggling, I was looking through your Instagram, and one of the posts was that knitting is just math and shapes clothes. And you were showing how much math you use for your patterns.
Yeah, so on that post, I recently published a pattern called the Abacus Wrap. I have it right here. And it's basically a stitch pattern that emphasizes one color or another, depending on what side of the piece you're on. And it uses something called long stitches, and that's just where like the stitch is taller. And it's also called drop stitch lace in some techniques, especially in the context of a machine. I've seen it called that. But basically with the pattern, you use dice to determine where the stripe ends, where it switches from the dominant yellow color to the dominant gray.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a bunch of random outcomes. And I know you're friends with Mary Martin, and she actually knows, everyone knows some math, right? But she's got a PhD and everything. So we talk about things like that. And we actually ended up working on the pattern a little bit, just the math part together, because I could not figure out. It was just a little bit above me to check my own work, you know? And it was one of those problems where it was like, I think I know how to do it, but I think a mathematician or someone who at least is a professional level, like expert on this, should look at it. And we actually hung out at a show afterwards because we had so much fun talking about math and spreadsheets.
And yet, actually, the funniest part, like talking of Mary Martin, the first time I met your mom in person was at Rhinebeck, and Mary Martin was teaching her how to do the fusion knitting. So I was sitting with them. It was a private class and the lunch table, and I was just sitting with them and observing it. That's how I met your mom. So it was like connected back to Mary Martin. She's like pretty incredible with what she's doing.
I think one thing that I really appreciate about Mary's style of writing patterns is that she doesn't get tied to standards that aren't logical for what she's doing. She goes with the most logical way of explaining things, and she will teach you how the patterns work.
Right.
But what it does is, instead of it being like complicated reading all through a project, it's like a little bit of learning up front, and then you really don't have to do as much work to read the pattern as you go through it.
Right. Well, one thing you and Mary have in common, and I appreciate about both of you, is that you sort of revolutionized knitting where I thought there was like nothing new to be discovered in this field, because you started your first project was something that's never been done before. You call it the Fox Paw, and it was done in fabrics, but not in knitting. So it was like your design that you created, and you've been teaching Fox Paw technique since then, right?
Yeah. So
Why move is such a like difficult path? Like, why did you decide to start with like something that doesn't exist as your first pattern?
well, the thing that's interesting is that it does exist. It just doesn't, it didn't exist for hand knitting. It was something that could be figured out, probably. I mean, not everything can, but it's one of those kind of like puzzles, but it definitely wasn't an unknown concept of making some really wavy stitches. The difference is that when you see those commercially produced, they're using something called a warp knit machine, and that's like a bunch of bobbins making each stripe all at once. So the threads are going vertically, and we knit side to side by hand generally. I've always thought it would be fun to try warp knitting by hand, and I've seen like one person post it online, but it's a loom type of knitting. It's not the same kind of action on a machine as what you'd think of even as those machines where something goes like across and back, because again, that's like side to side. So it was there, and that's why I picked it. I was interested in converting something over from one area of knitting to another. And I think that it's really interesting because people always say there's not a lot that's new. And I should mention, some of the things that I used in the stack stitch techniques exist. I found like a few prior examples, and I did a lot of research. The decrease specifically is found in seams in a few people's work. Debbie New is one of the designers who uses it, and I've seen it in some Japanese patterns as well, but not in that context, right? So they're using it as a seam or a shaping. So it wasn't exactly unknown, you know. So what's interesting about knitting is that there's a lot of this idea that it's kind of an old thing, but when you look at textiles, weaving's much older, and like there's a lot of area to innovate in knitting and crochet, and especially in the space between those two things. Do you know the Internet Archive?
Yeah.
That website where it's I don't know, for people watching who might not know it, it's a like a database. It's almost like a virtual library, and you can get PDFs of old publications that are like past copyright dates. And there's a weird time period where crochet was really new and people were experimenting. And there's this book that they have called Crow Knitting.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of a few years ago when knooking was a thing, the crochet hook knitting thing. But they have all these like stitches that are crocheted and knit at the same time. Almost like Tunisian crochet, but not. And like, it's a totally different area of fiber arts than what I've seen around. And it's just hanging out there. Like, no one's exploring it. There's a ton of interesting stuff to look at in these old books. And I think sometimes we don't think of how relatively new knitting is.
Right. Well, like you had a degree in industrial design, right? Do you think that influences how you see knitting? Do you think you look onto knitting through the eyes of industrial designer?
Yeah, I try to look at it when I'm doing designs. I try not to look at it just as a aesthetic thing. Like, even if it's a design that I'm only working within the realm of like the visuals, I try to have something that's like the problem that I'm trying to solve. So sometimes I'll say, well, what looks nice? And then how do I make this a different kind of like accessory shape wise or something so that I'm solving a wearability problem? Or maybe it's like, how do I make something using this type of stitch? And that's the problem is that I'm solving is how to use that stitch and make something a certain kind of garment or something. But I try to approach things as like a problem to solve, even if it's on a stitch level, even if it's just I want to do something that has a lace border. Okay, let's start from scratch to design the lace, because as much as stitch dictionaries are cool, if the stitch dictionaries out there, I think a lot of people probably have access to it, and I don't need to be, I don't want to sound like I'm insulting certain types of design, because I don't do complex shaping in garments. So since I'm working in the realm of accessories and I'm not working on shaped garments that have fit and other things, I try to take my stitch patterns and make those be the innovative thing, because the shaping isn't.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit deeper about this, right? There are so many stitch dictionaries. And actually, as we speak, I have my first pattern tested. And I call this pattern Sweet Surrender because I've been coded and like trying to be convinced to become a designer. And I resisted it with like all I could. But then I needed a gift to a friend who is a yarn dyer. And she said everybody was asking me for this pattern because she put it in her booth and everybody was asking what's the pattern. She's like, can you just please write it down? And it's super simple. There was like nothing to it. There's nothing innovative about that specific shawl. I decided just to humor her, basically, to write it down. And that's why I'm calling it Sweet Surrender. But like, where do you draw the line of what you comfortably calling your design and what's just another interpretation of the same pattern from Stitch Dictionary?
There's a legal answer to that. Like one of my jobs when I left college was footwear design, and I worked at a few companies where most of my job wasn't making new things. Most of my job was making knockoffs that had the correct amount of change to not get the company sued, right? So there is like there are some real actual legal benchmarks that you could put to that, like what's a new design and what's not. But that's kind of like a weird, like lawyerization of like what counts as new. I think that anytime like someone writes something down, we're not talking about just finished objects here, because part of the design for the designer is the pattern itself. So if you figured out how to write down a stitch pattern that's existed for 200 years or whatever, in a way that helps someone figure it out, and that way of writing it down is different even, and the product is not, that's still like a new design. So I hesitate to say, oh, like what does this count as something, even though it looks like something else? You know, sometimes it's more about the way that you write things than what you're getting. And sometimes, you know, people really want to see stitches that they haven't seen before, but they're just two different types of design. The place where it's like kind of sketchy is like, I guess sometimes people probably knock people off in knitting as well as just like in mainstream fashion.
Right.
But because it's such a small industry, usually, you know, when stuff looks too close together, people notice. And I think almost sometimes people can get too, people are too quick to say this is a copy instead of saying this is a very close result that had its own long and like unique origin or unique instructions. Because
like I was talking to Suzanne Bryan one time about it, and she is the she's certified hand master knitter, and she was on the committee that was examining the final projects for the hand master knitting program. And she told me this story how one time they got two practically identical sweaters. It was like cable sweaters, and they came from different parts of the world, but they were like the same cable pattern and they looked practically identical, and the knitters didn't even know each other, and how there's like, at the end of the day, there is not infinite amount of different variations of stitches, right? So like it's almost bound to happen at some point.
So I have a story about this because I recently had this situation. First of all, one of my old hobbies that I used to do was origami. When I was in high school, I had these study halls where I was supposed to do homework. I would fold paper into like geodesic domes instead. And I was really into origami. And so that just some background here. I was at Vogue Knitting Live, and there's a teacher there who I always wanted to meet ever since I saw her book come out, Asha Brill, who has this concept in knitting called disc stitch. I don't know if
I haven't seen it.
You should look at it. It's very cool. It's basically like, I'm not going to describe it properly because conceptually it's so different from other things I've seen in knitting that I don't know if I can do it justice, but it's super interesting, and it can have potential to do a lot of things, design things, but also like it can be used to reinforce areas of fabric.
Mm-hmm.
So we were talking, and she said, that thing that you showed on Instagram a few months ago, well, I made the same stitch. We did the same stitch if you look at it at the end. But the way that we executed it on the needles was completely different.
Interesting.
We were both working on this completely independently. And we were both working on this completely independently around the same time. Probably because we both saw something and we're like, that's interesting. I wonder if I went in the other direction. Or it's just like we're all kind of seeing the same techniques and building on them at the same time. So we happened to go in the same direction, even though we didn't know each other at the time. Back to the origami thing, though, she ran to get her samples at Vogue Knitting Live, and when she came back, I was like, this is so weird, but one of my favorite origami artists has your name, but obviously you're not related, right? And she was like, that's my husband.
Oh, fine. What a small world.
And she also she in her own right is a very accomplished origami person. I have her book now. So I'm going to have to try some stuff from it, but it goes to show that there's a lot of overlap there with a lot of people.
Let's talk about your teaching career, because you do a lot of teaching all over the world, basically. And you just came from New Zealand. You were teaching there also?
Mm-hmm. So
when you first started teaching, it was because of the Fox Paw, right? Like you were teaching that specific technique. Have you ever got tired of teaching that class? And like, how many classes do you teach now?
I don't know how many times I've taught it. For a while, I actually kept student surveys from every class. And it got to be too much. And they weren't kinds of surveys like with feedback even. It was actually, I was keeping data on what hand people held their yarn in, whether people were left-handed, whether people prefer visual instructions or written instructions or all that stuff. Like it wasn't, but after I think the first 5 years of teaching, I had to stop keeping records because for all of those Fox Paws classes, there were like hundreds of students at a certain point. And so I did start teaching because of the Fox Paws pattern. It's a tricky pattern, so it's good to show people how to do it. And so, I don't know, in knitting, sometimes patterns are really just a set of instructions. In 2020, I got back into quilting a little bit with the pandemic and started reading quilt patterns. And what I've noticed is that quilt patterns are mostly there because they're a shortcut. Like they make things much simpler or much faster to do. And so the reason I started teaching the Fox Paws knitting pattern was because I had all the shortcuts. So a lot of the stuff that I teach isn't the kind of thing you can put in a pattern without having the pattern literally just be like a 6-hour class.
Right.
So I started there. I teach a lot of other things now because people want to have something to go with it. And I think a lot of the other people I see in knitting who are teaching, they teach whatever they figure out the shortcuts to do. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I really don't know how many people I've taught, but now I have taught it like officially on another continent, which is cool because I was just teaching in New Zealand and Australia. And what's so interesting is that every class is completely different. So I don't really get bored of teaching it. It's actually at a nice place. If I'm teaching a class that I've been teaching for like 1 or 2 years, it's at a nice place where I can anticipate most of the common problems that come up without being so, I don't know, jaded isn't exactly the right word, but basically still like engaged and having it like the class be dynamic and, you know, exciting for people. And so the fact that the class I teach the most is pretty complex, it keeps it new.
Well, you've mentioned in one of your Instagram posts that somebody was asking you if there is beginner-friendly patterns and that mostly you don't do beginner-friendly. Like so some of it is somewhat beginner-friendly, but like not really. Is that by choice? Like, do you stay away from beginner patterns?
I think that it's hard to know because when I have to label what my patterns are in terms of difficulty, my perception of how hard they are is that most of them fall into the intermediate range. Actually, most of my patterns, they're not beginner, but they're also not advanced. But that said, if you've gone through and you've like completed all the beginner skills that you need to like read patterns and stuff, and you've never done cables, and you pick a cable sweater, that pattern is going to seem more advanced than if you already learned that technique. So I understand for a lot of the patterns where I have unusual techniques, it's going to be something that requires learning. What I like to say is people have to be adventurous.
Right.
And some places have started putting adventurous beginner as like a category. And so I have classes that fall into that. I just don't feel comfortable saying that it's beginner content because when I think of true beginner content, I'm thinking of someone teaching you how to knit, how to purl, someone maybe teaching you how to read patterns and how to do those basic skills. And very few things are actually beginner, you know, like.
I mean, it also like depends on the person's almost, I want to say self-esteem, right? Like there are people who knitted for 60 years and they consider themselves like adventurous beginners. And then there are people who just started yesterday and they consider themselves experts. So it's also like depends on the person's perception of their own skills. So it's hard to predict where they're going to fall in that.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of teaching classes, I tend not to teach beginner classes because I feel like to teach a beginner class, you have to be really good at the teaching. Like the teaching part is the primary thing. I don't have too many helpful tips for beginners. I'm too far removed from learning stuff like that to have thought about. Like I was a child. I don't think I could get back into the headspace of thing like that to know what people need. So I tend to stay away from that with classes, but I will teach like an introduction to something that's like the next step. And so for my Fox Paws class, I say you can be a beginner and walk in as long as you have some experience reading patterns you've done some increases and some decreases, and you know what that means to do that, you'll be okay.
Right. And
Sometimes better than people who are expecting to walk in and have a really easy time because they've done a bunch of things, but none of the things that they've done are like what we're doing.
Right.
So.
And you've done also a lot of tutorials that you have on YouTube. So like for people who more visual learners, they can go and watch you do those stitches and like learn exactly how you do it. So it's like an extra help for the pattern, basically.
Yeah, I think that's the direction that patterns are moving, is like a hybrid format. Of course, all the information is in the written pattern. And if you don't have YouTube, which not everyone does,
right.
Have access to internet like that, where they can just watch videos over and over. You know, there's usually both, but I think it's always actually really helpful if there's a new stitch in something, or even a mundane stitch, but I can provide a link and people can just click and see how to do that stitch. That's a great way to ensure that your patterns are more accessible to beginners. Like, also, there are a lot of people, the ratio of English, most people who do my patterns speak some English because I speak English, right? But the approachability for people who don't speak English as a first language or as a fluent language is much better when I have those videos. So I've started including them a lot more often because a lot of my customers are not English speakers, at least as a first language.
Right. Well, if anybody goes to your Ravelry, they might notice that you look very different now than you looked on some of those pictures from the beginning of your design career. And I want to talk a little bit about the community and how they accepted your transition. So the other instructors, your colleagues, your fans, people who knitted your patterns, was that the easy transition for you? Was community supportive?
I think that when I first decided to transition, I was pretty nervous about it, and I didn't need to be as nervous as I was. I was thinking about all of the kind of like wrong things in terms of whether people would be accepting or whether people would I don't know, whether I would still be able to work, basically. And it's turned out that everything in terms of work has been pretty much fine. You know, there are weird people everywhere. So there's some stuff that's happened, but I don't think it would be very different in any other career. I think what I was most concerned about was that I had a really public name, and also my face is on a lot of stuff. And it took a while to just say, like, people already have the pictures. Like, who cares? Like, they also don't know who's in the picture. I haven't had a lot of people who are confused by the before and after situation actually ask me. They're just like, oh, who's that? I'm like, oh, yeah, don't worry about it. Like, because I don't want to, it's not important to, like, essentially confuse people more.
Right. Well, you were very vocal about your transition and like showing the pictures, right? And showing how you were basically taking the same pictures, but now, right after the transition. And I actually liked it a lot because like you could see you see that it's the same person, and you can be transitioning from one thing to another, but it's the same person and the same project. So like that's not what's important here. Do you find that, like, since you transitioned, do you think about different kinds of designs, or do you think it's like it still continues to be the same idea of designs? Do you approach designs differently?
Well, first of all, those pictures, the reason that I wanted to do some of those was mostly because they remind me of, when you see like the kids picture and they recreate it grown up. I just love those on the internet. Like, I think it's so much fun. So having the opportunity to do something like that has been kind of like a fun project to take on at some points in time and to like actually put effort into recreating a photo shoot. And sometimes I don't have some of the same clothes, like, or they just don't fit right, but we try to stay accurate. So those are kind of fun, but my thinking about design hasn't changed much. One of the things that is hard to explain is that it was, I think a lot of designers do design for themselves, and I never did. So I'm always thinking about a puzzle or a problem to solve. I'm very rarely thinking about that just in terms of myself. Those projects rarely get published. So if I am doing that kind of thing for myself, it's it's usually the kind of project that's not too interesting to other people. So I just, and if I ever show it in public, the like 3 people who are interested will beg me for patterns for years. So I don't even show people what I'm doing anymore, if I don't want to do a pattern. But yeah, it's never been just designing for me. So it hasn't been a big shift there. At a certain point, though, there are some things that I like to design, and now I have to go find models that have the right body type.
Right.
So that's different, but that's a whole thing.
Well, you mentioned somewhere that you don't even publish the most difficult thing you design out there, like you keep those for yourself. Do you have time to knit for yourself, or just because it's like became a profession and it's your full-time job, and is it difficult to knit just for pleasure?
No, most of the things that I do, I like doing. And I do have a lot of downtime. I'm looking at I have like a cart of like stuff here to see if there's something that's a good example of something I did for myself. But, and when I say I keep the most difficult stuff for myself, like if I make something, if I design something and it's difficult to do, I don't publish it because if I don't enjoy making a swatch, I will not want to make a project. And I don't think anyone else will. Like, and there's always an exception to that rule. Someone else will claim that they want to do it, but ultimately I have to want to make a sample. So that's why some things, if you experiment too much, you end up with things that are just not physically fun to do. But that's a little different. I have time to make myself stuff. I've been meaning to make myself a sweater, so I got some yarn for that. I'm in the middle of making myself a sweater and I can't find it because I moved. And so I literally just bought new yarn because I don't know where I put my project, which I have to rip out because I've changed sizes in the meantime. But, I think a lot of designers either work mostly for what they want to do or kind of avoid it. I don't think there are a lot of people who are just kind of like half and half.
Well, when a lot of designers, like when I talk to them, when they're just starting the first excitement of the first patterns, right? The goal is to get to the point when the yarn companies want to work with you and they give you free yarn. And I know that that's not how you see things now, because we sort of chatted about it at H&H, that's you have to be fairly pricing your work. Is it difficult for you to put a price on your patterns? And I know that like a year ago you raised the price of the patterns, but before you did that, you did like a month-long sale for anybody who wants to get it at lower price. Like, is it a tough place to put the price on your work?
No, I know what I would pay for a pattern. I know what I would pay for a book. I know what I would pay for yarn. And I know that for myself, most of the money is to yarn. Like, obviously, the pattern, like, it depends on the size of the project, but the pattern is not going to be something that's taking up like the majority of the cost. But I respect the fact that people want a pattern that, isn't going to be so expensive that they can't afford the yarn that they want. but also patterns are reusable. So, when I raised my prices, it was more to keep up with the fees that PayPal increased their fees by a certain percentage, and that stuff has changed over time, right? Their credit card fees. But to have someone be able to afford something that's the price of like a ball of yarn at a craft store is, I think, a good range to be in, because it's not undervaluing it where most of it's being eaten by PayPal or whoever is processing, but it's not like pricing people out, because I do think that patterns, for sweaters, I would be willing to pay much more than for like an accessory. So I'm conscious of that when I am putting prices together. I don't like to make it so that people have to make this big purchase. Now, if it's a book, I will buy a book for one pattern. But I know that when I put that book away, the first thing I do, if I'm looking for a new pattern, I'm going to go to the books that I have and see if there's something in there that I can use. And I go to the library a lot too. I'm not a pattern buyer. So I like to be conscious of other people who are like me, who prefer to focus on getting nice yarn. Because ultimately you're not wearing the pattern.
Right.
Like you're feeling the yarn, you're feeling the fiber.
One of the most shocking Instagram posts that I saw of yours was where you made mushroom pierogies, and you said that you are very thrifty on your food prices and you want to make a meal under 5 cents. Tell me where that came from and why is it so important to you?
So we now live across from a grocery store, and so actually we hardly ever buy things that aren't on sale. We get the ad, and we get a lot of stuff that's on that. I don't know if your grocery store has like the almost expired food shelf.
Right.
I get a lot of stuff from the almost expired shelf. And there are two reasons. It's good to save money on groceries, right? Like, who doesn't want to save money on groceries? But also, I'm not so great at meal planning. So if I can look at something and say, okay, this is the thing that fits in the budget this week, what are we going to do with this, like chicken or whatever? That's a great starting point for dinner. And it's been going pretty well, especially since we can go whenever. Like, that's what I have to do after this, is I have to go, and I haven't looked at my ad yet, but it's kind of like a fun little grocery puzzle, with like couponing, because people treat couponing like a sport sometimes. But also foraging is interesting. I've been doing less because I've been traveling and not walking around in the park. But it's always kind of fun to see what you can make. And I don't buy a lot of packaged foods. I don't know how people can buy like the pre-made food. I go to a restaurant. Like I was just eating crackers earlier, and it's the first time I've had crackers like from a box in a very long time. And I was looking at the box and I was like, this is so weird. There's a picture of the crackers on the box. And I was like, what is wrong with me? Most people just eat a box of crackers.
Do you cook every day?
Yeah, we cook almost every day.
You want to share your favorite thing to make? Something quick and delicious?
So some of my patterns have recipes in them. I don't know if you saw that. But I think my favorite recipe right now has been roasted vegetables. It's summer, so we've been doing a lot of like, when the produce is pretty good, we'll go get like a big like cauliflower or cabbage and slice it up and roast it in the oven. And it's just super easy, but it's like, I don't know, it's tastes better than stuff that is prepackaged or pre-made, and it's also like budget friendly.
Right. There's actually one thing that I'm dying to do because I saw it on your Instagram, and it's to make the print of the mushroom cap.
Yes.
It
Wasn't
was so cool. It was like amazing. I never even thought about doing something like this, and it looks stunning.
So I was so surprised. And I've done that, like I did it a few years ago and it didn't come out well. Like I did it. So what I did last year, I found there were mushrooms that were about this big at the park, apparently edible. Apparently is not good enough. Um, since they were so big, but you can use like grocery store like portobello mushrooms that are like that big. And a spore print is where when the mushroom opens up and the spores come out, if you put it on a piece of paper, sometimes they show up. Sometimes they're like white. If you use white paper, it won't show up, right? But this one happened to be dark and it like left a very cool print on the page. They were giant too. And it was just fun to experiment with. There's always art supplies around. Also, I live across the street from Michael's, which helps.
Well, that's it. Or is it difficult to stay away from Michael's?
It was at first. I actually blogged when I moved. I like did a video like every day for like a while saying I'm not going to Michael's, and then eventually I just needed something, you know. But it's actually not that hard to avoid because um, once you realize it's not going anywhere, it's always there.
Right.
I can like not buy everything in the store and take it home because it's right there.
It's actually my favorite thing to ask yarn store owners. Like when I interview them, do you have a personal stash or do you treat the whole store as your personal stash? And more often than not, they have just as much yarn at home as they do in the store.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but also like living across from Michael's, I think what I see is I could call it my local yarn store. I live also between two other pretty nice local yarn stores, but they're kind of far away. So I also like to think of it as like a very good read of what's available in most places to like the closest thing to most people in the United States is more like Michael's,
right,
if not Michael's, than anything else. So like it's good because if I can get my supplies at Michael's, most people can find them. And then finally publishing a crochet pattern, like specifically a granny stitch pattern, a blanket, there that Michael's is perfect because anything at a like local yarn store type price point, it would have to be superwash, and that's a whole thing to get into, like to find something that's washable to make a blanket in. But then like it took 16 balls of Red Heart, not Red Heart, the Michael's brand, but it like big. It just most people aren't going to be going anywhere but like the craft store for that. So it was really very clear to me, like especially if you crochet, why it's important to use the
right.
craft store stuff.
Well, let's talk about how you found yourself crocheting because it wasn't a happy accident, basically, from what I've heard. Right?
Yeah, I actually when I was 10, my father tried to teach me and I couldn't figure it out. So first, I should acknowledge that he tried, and that he was the crocheter and he learned from his mother, but like the words didn't make sense. The whole like double single thing really made it harder for me to learn. And I didn't end up picking it up really until I had this medical issue where I couldn't use my left hand, which is kind of important in knitting,
Right.
to have two. but it's way easier to crochet with one. So that's when I kind of picked it up, and I got a leisure arts book from Michaels. Michaels should sponsor this. A leisure arts book from Michaels and some really ugly yarn. And learned from the book because I couldn't use my hand. And my father was also in the hospital, so he couldn't teach me.
Right.
It was a rough time. But I ended up learning that and then putting it aside for a pretty long time once my hand was usable again. It's when you learn a new skill, it's definitely harder than the one that you know better. So I wasn't going to put myself through that. But
well, if you had to choose just one, would you go to knitting still, or did crochet found its place in your heart?
I would still go with knitting because crochet has a lot of things that it can do really well, but ultimately it's not as forgiving of mistakes.
Right.
And knitting, the same thing that makes it, people will say, I like crochet because you can't, like, it can't ladder the same way. That's what I don't like about it because it's not as fixable,
Right.
Which is actually really frustrating. So that's the biggest lesson that I learned working on a big crochet project was you cannot just drop down and fix something.
I've heard you talking about that you like multitasking, and I thought I liked multitasking, but then I saw what you mean by multitasking, and you put me in the dust with your multitasking because you were biking, reading pattern, knitting, and watching TV all at the same time. Is that something you do all the time?
No, that was a little bit of a joke because I don't usually do that much. It has to be the right pattern to do on the bike. Like, unfortunately, you would think the exercise bike would be perfect, but like, there's nowhere to put something on my lap. So like, it has to be taped to something.
Mm.
But it's usually just two out of those three.
But do you combine like knitting with TV watching?
Yeah.
That's often.
I've been doing Star Trek, I know like they're not technically new, but like the newer ones, which I waited to watch, like I saved them until there were a bunch of seasons so that I could do a bunch at a time. But I've been enjoying that, so I've been knitting while watching Star Trek, and I'm always looking for stuff. Another one that was good was Deadlock. Do you like mysteries?
I love mysteries.
It's a really funny mystery show. It's about some murders that are going on in, I think, Tasmania. And it's like one of those dramedies where it's like a very serious crime, but the cops are kind of like silly detectives.
I'll have to check it out. I haven't.
Oh yeah, it's
one.
I think it's getting a second season. It's one of those shows that was a very successful export to globally. So it's worth checking out if you like mysteries.
Right. Well, we started our conversation with Kay Fawcett, and I sort of want to bring it a little bit back to him because I saw you doing Knit Stars. You were in season 7. And then I saw the project that you did for Knit Stars season 7. And right before that, you said that your biggest phobia is fear, like you have fear of beige. And then you did this like gray scarf in my color. Did you overcome your fear of beige, or like was it a challenge for you to knit something in just one color?
No. I just it's easier to use multiple colors and have it be interesting than to use one. And I pick my colors based on what they're going to be next to online. I think most people find my stuff on Ravelry. So if it looks good in a small, like a tiny picture on a screen, that's the color that I'll use. So I don't, although I don't wear beige, like as a personal choice, it looks awful on me. I have nothing against beige itself. I will wear gray, but it's not necessarily what I'll pick for design projects unless there's something else backing them up. Like it's Knit Stars. The class is the thing that people are buying. They're not buying the scarf. So the scarf can then be a little bit more of a wearable color in the photos because I don't need to rely on those photos to grab people like to pop out on Instagram or whatever. And it was fine, and I wear it. Like I do wear it. I just um didn't want to overrule the theme of texture. They had a theme of texture, and the best way to show that is to not pick crazy colors.
What's your relationship with Instagram? Like, do you aimlessly scroll there? Do you just pop in to put your picture and don't even look at what others post? Like, how do you use it?
So the stuff that it shows me now is not like it shows me a lot of stuff that I don't follow, and I know that there you can turn it to back to follow, but I actually have gone back on to the more primitive, less algorithmic apps. I was on TikTok for a while. It's become so hard to get views there.
Right.
And like it's just like not how it was a few years ago, in terms of like just the content being stuff that I'm interested in. So I've gone back onto Tumblr and Reddit. Not necessarily, I'm not posting that much on Reddit. Um, but I do look at the craft stuff that's going on a lot on Tumblr because I can like follow people who are interested in the same things that I'm interested in and see what they're interested in. If you know about Tumblr, there's a lot of like repost abilities. So a lot of the time, what you won't, you'll see a lot of non-original content where people are talking about another artist, which is really cool because on Instagram, that has to be like a whole like collaborative thing. Like, and I don't even know if people do that Instagram takeover stuff anymore. But a lot of the time, it has to be like formally set up because people consider it like stealing art if you post someone else's thing to Instagram. Whereas on Reddit, the understanding is that if you post something and say this is so and so and link to them, like you're not stealing it. It's appreciative. So it's easier to find stuff that I think is interesting and cool. On Tumblr, again, I hope it exists in a few months because financially the app is not successful.
Right.
But like, I just haven't been, I go on Instagram. It's just like, things have changed so much. A lot of things are like shopping oriented. It's harder to find stuff.
Yeah, I find Instagram turning more and more into marketplace. It's mostly like ads of things to buy.
I mean, I think they said 2 years ago, Instagram is no longer a photo sharing platform. It's a shop and video platform. And then they backtracked on the video thing. And that's the same thing that's happened with TikTok. They put in this shop stuff, and I have a TikTok shop. But I also, because I did that, I can't use non-commercial sound. So it's just not fun. Like I can't do any memes. It's not fun. A lot of stuff just has like a shopping link in it. And it's like,
right.
Not.
And the problem is like once you stop at something, they start showing you 60 of the same things. And you're like, I didn't even want to watch the first thing. I just accidentally stopped there, you know?
Yeah. And like, I think Instagram is similar, but it's still better than a lot of platforms. And of course, like Reddit is mostly help-based posts. But I don't know. I think the most interesting places to see new and interesting things is actually going to events still.
Well, speaking of events, tell me where people can find you for the rest of this year. Like, what's your plans? How booked you are?
I am not very booked. I'm not doing anything until August. I'm doing my first cruise with Melissa Liebman and the other teacher, besides obviously Melissa, but she also runs the
Right.
event, is Hohi Locatelli. So I'm excited for that because she's literally one of the nicest people.
I'm actually going on a knitting retreat on like the end of this week with Hohi in Italy. So I'm very excited for that.
Italy. Where in Italy?
Dolomites.
My mother's going to Italy next week for a wedding.
Oh, I thought she's going for the same retreat. I got very excited.
But Hohi's super sweet, and I really appreciate her designs. I think that she's one of the most wearable designers.
Yeah.
Which is like kind of like the opposite. Like she approaches design from like a style standpoint. That's what I was saying like before, like not all designers have the same approach. But I think that her like approach creates really wearable garments, and everything she does looks like it could just be like sold like in a magazine. Like
no, I agree.
You don't have to knit to appreciate it. And so I love her stuff, and I'm excited to hang out with her. And I'm excited that you get to hang out with her too. I'm so excited to see how that trip goes.
Yeah, she did some special design for that retreat. So we're gonna be learning some new technique with her and knitting a tank top that she created for that specific retreat.
Yeah, I think that her garments are like, there aren't too many people who I would be like, is everyone on the like going to be able to like this thing? But she makes stuff that's so like universal. I don't want to say basic because that has like a negative connotation too, but in the positive sense, like basics that you could just wear over and over again or make over and over again. So I love that.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you like one question about yarn festivals. So one of the first time I saw you, I think it was at Rhinebeck, and you were carrying this sign with your what do you call it? The scan
QR code.
QR code. And then you told me that it was harder when you came to walk. Tell me that story.
So I was hoping to have the knitted QR code with me. It must still be in my bags from Australia. But I knit this big sign. And I think I first knit it for when Knit Stars came out in 2021. And it's always been like a little bit unusual to walk around wearing something at Rhinebeck, and I forget when it happened, but at some point, even if I wasn't wearing something, people could figure out who I was. But with the sign, it's a little bit more like that episode of Black Mirror where the girl is trapped in, it's like actually a prison, and it's people following her with cell phones. I'm not saying like I wouldn't carry it if I didn't want that, but it can be kind of funny because I forget I'm carrying a QR code and people will like come up and just take pictures and leave. And it's like, hello? Like, hi.
But you were hoping it was a conversation starter, but the people.
Yeah, it is a conversation starter, but then I'll be in the conversation and forget that I have it. And like people are coming up and I'm like, yeah, but it's fun and it's a really easy project. I actually got it from Instructables, which is like Web 2.0 era, like circa 2010 era craft website, I guess. Not just crafts, but like anything that you can make or do. Just tutorials of all that stuff, and it's actually a crochet pattern. Okay. So it's the same principle. But if anyone's interested in making a knitted QR code or a crochet QR code, you can look it up, and there's instructions online. I hate to take, people give me a lot more credit than
Then you deserve.
than I deserve for that one. And then they'll be like, oh, wow, that's such a good idea. And I say, you should make one. And they're like, oh, I wouldn't want to copy you. And I'm like, this is not my idea.
Just use your own QR code.
Right. It's only, the only thing about it that's mine is the code.
So you didn't want to work with that on Times Square, going to work?
I lost it in Times Square. I left one in Times Square at Vogue. I left it in La Marriott, I think. I left one somewhere.
Wow.
I have a new one now. I might do it. I might see, but what I've been thinking more likely is that I might try putting it in a window sometime when I'm staying in a hotel, not in Times Square, and just seeing what the analytics are. If like how many people see a random QR code and scan it. I would love to know.
Would be interesting, yeah.
It looks handmade, so it's less suspicious than, or it's more intriguing than like a little one.
No, it definitely is showstopper. You know, when I first saw it, I was like,
it's fun, and I'm sure that you could make a quilted one too.
That's a good idea.
I think it would be faster, maybe, but it's not. It's actually the worst project. It's like they're very cool, but all the stitches are essentially random.
Right.
So
it has to be exact, so you can't make a mistake.
Yeah, you can't make a mistake, and you can't test it as you go. So if you get it finished and like the gauges, there's a lot of factors that could make it not scannable, and you can't tell until it's done, which is nerve-wracking.
Right.
But they've all worked out. As long as the grid has been okay. And I guess the camera can account for some, like, if it can account for perspective, it can account for gauge discrepancies.
Right, right. Well, I hope to see it again sometime soon at one of the festivals. I wish you the best of time in August with Melissa and Hohi. That sounds like a super fun trip. And I hope to see you soon at one festival or another. It's always fun to see you.
Yeah, well, I hope that you have fun in Italy. That's so exciting.
Thank you. I'll keep you posted on how that goes.
Are you going to be blogging it? Vlogging? Are you going to be?
Might be videoing it. I'll try. I no promises yet, but like I'll try to film something, but we'll see how it goes. Well, Xandy, thank you so very much for being my guest today. It was super fun to get to know you a little bit better and chat.
Thank you for having me. It's been a long time that I've been hoping to do this, so thank you for being patient.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.